Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the IUCN Bear Specialist Group North American Bears Expert Team webinar series. We want to welcome NABIT committee members as well as other BSG members in attendance today. Just thought I'd start with a little bit of news for those of you that haven't heard. The National Park Service in the United States has moved one step closer to reintroducing grizzly bears into the North Cascades of Washington State. They published their final environmental impact statement, and the preferred alternative includes establishment of an experimental population under Section 10J of the Endangered Species Act. And it calls for releasing 3 to 7 grizzly bears for 5 to 10 years with a goal of establishing an initial population of 25 bears. Still a lot of administrative steps to go. A determination and the final record of decision will be released at another time. And of course, more public comment will occur, but just wanted to pass on that news. There is some movement. I won't put Wayne on the spot, but Chris, is there anything you want to say about this? I think this probably started back in your day when you were working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as the grizzly bear recovery coordinator.
Well, the first effort started when I was there, and then it died with the previous, lunkhead administration, and now it's been rejuvenated, and Wayne is doing a great job of trying to keep it alive. So Let's hope for the best.
Okay.
What is the position of your department, Rich?
We're not going to get into that, but go ahead, Wayne. You got a comment?
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to say here is this is just a final EIS. 30 days remain before there will be a decision notice posted.
Thank you.
For the EIS, and subsequent to that, there will be a final rule published on the 10J that will come at some point after that. And that's the only thing I want to say. This is not a final decision yet. Just keep that in mind.
Thank you. Oh, somebody's got a phone ringing. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Today's presentation is titled Large-Scale Monitoring of Ontario's Black Bear Population to Inform Harvest Management. And it's by our NABIT member, Joe Northrup. Like always, we hope to finish today's webinar within 1 hour to respect everybody's time. Don't forget, you can use the chat function to ask questions, and we'll get to the questions at the end of the presentation. Please mute your microphones if you haven't yet. And with that said, we want to welcome Joe Northrup. Joe, take us to Ontario, Canada.
All right, how's it look? I was able to share it again successfully? All right,
yes.
Cool. Thank you very much. And yeah, thanks for having me here to talk about this work that's completed / ongoing. So, yeah, before I get going, I always like to share. Well, I've started to like to try to acknowledge folks at the beginning of talks so I don't forget at the end. So this is the work I'm going to talk about today is a pretty massive project that has had a lot of input and help from a lot of different folks, both within our government agency as well as academics, students, a large variety of folks. But the 3 folks just wanted to mention at the top here, that design and implementation group, Kaela, Beauclerc, who runs all of our genetics lab work here in Ontario, Derek Potter, who organized and implemented all the sort of logistics of this work, and then Eric Howe, who also is on the call today to answer any statistical questions. But Eric did all of the statistical analysis and a lot of the design of this project that I'll talk about both earlier before I started with our agency and since then as well. And so happy to have Eric here as well to help talk about this stuff. And this is really work that all of this group has done sort of collectively. Okay, so background for what I'll talk about today. I'm going to go into probably a bit of a longer background than typical, just to sort of set the stage for why this project came about. And so I'll get into sort of the background on black bear management in Ontario and specifically sort of how we manage and how we assess the sustainability of harvest in the province. I'll then discuss the provincial scale population monitoring program that we implemented. And then I'll finish up if there's time to talk about how we are leveraging these data as well as other monitoring program data to answer applied questions as well as some more fundamental sort of black bear ecological questions. Yeah, where are we talking about here? I know there's the international group, obviously, and so just wanted to orient this around sort of where this all takes place. So this is North America. Ontario's here, one of the biggest provinces in Canada, highly varied, large city of Toronto, up to around 13 million people in the Greater Toronto area, and then varying all the way up to the coast of Hudson Bay here. There's four main forest types in Ontario. Three as it sort of relates to black bears. This map on the left shows those. So in the far southwest, we have remnant deciduous forest, but it's really mostly agriculture and cities at this point. We then have the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest in this sort of tan color here, and this is really mixed deciduous forest. So lots of deciduous trees, lots of hard mast. And then we have a big swath of area in boreal forest, and then we have the Hudson Bay lowlands in the far northern part of the province, which is the world's third largest wetland. And there are black bears. We don't really know the density, but lots of bears across that entire area. Figure on the right shows our sort of harvest administrative, or not administrative, but sort of our harvest zones, our black bear ecological zones, that sort of where we quantify black bear numbers according to sort of productivity and human density. So black bears exist and are harvested through most of that area in the colors here. We don't have much access in that northern part in those A's and B's. There's pretty much no roads in that entire area, save for a couple of winter ice roads. And so though there are bears up there, they're harvested very lightly, and most of the harvest would be from Indigenous harvest. And so black bears really are managed in all those other areas between G and D, C, and E up at the top. So between those areas there. So information on just sort of how we do harvest management, or how harvest is regulated, if you can say that it's regulated. So we have an open resident harvest in Ontario. So any Ontario resident can buy a black bear hunting tag. There's one tag per person per resident. But it's a completely open, unregulated resident harvest. We have, over the last 10 years, we've had around 22,000 resident hunters annually, harvesting on average 3,300 bears annually. We also have a significant non-resident harvest that's managed through tags that are allocated to outfitters. And we have many fewer non-resident hunters, but around 4,000 annually. And they harvest at a much higher rate, much higher success rate than residents. So around 2,200 bears harvested annually over the last 10 years in Ontario. And this is all from a population that's estimated to be between around 85 to 105,000, though some of the work we're doing is to update that estimate. So currently in Ontario, we have both a spring and a fall hunting season, but there's, over the last 20 years, there's been a very dynamic sort of situation as it relates to the spring season. Prior to 1999, we had a spring black bear hunting season. It was canceled in 1999. And so we had only a fall season up until 2014. Starting in 2014, we had a pilot spring season brought back in 8 wildlife management units, primarily influenced by conflict between people and bears. It was, those 8 units had more or less the highest rates of conflicts between people and bears. That was expanded to all units that had a hunt in the province in 2016. It was still considered a pilot at that time. There was no decision about whether it was going to be permanent. But then in 2019, it was reinstated fully as a regular permanent hunting season. So currently have both spring and fall seasons. Important piece of information here is just that between the cancellation in 1999 and the spring pilot, the fall season length was expanded pretty significantly by a few weeks. And so currently, as of today, we have more harvest opportunity from a time perspective than ever previously in the province. So bears can be hunted over more time than they ever have been since we've had regulated hunting of black bears. A couple more just sort of pieces of information for context around black bear harvest in Ontario. So most people that actively hunt specifically for black bears do so over bait, similar to what's shown in that picture in the top right there. Many resident hunters hunt black bears or will have a black bear tag when they're hunting deer and moose in the fall. And so a lot of our harvest does come from that, but most of the active black bear harvest is over bait. Females with cubs are protected in the spring, but not in the fall. So unlike some other jurisdictions, you can harvest if a female with cubs comes into a bait in the fall, they are able to be harvested. Okay, so bit of just background there on sort of on some of those pieces. And then I wanted to talk now just a little bit about how we actually go about managing harvest in the province. So with an open, completely open resident allocation system, how do we actually do any sort of harvest management? So the number one way that we do this is the restriction on outfitter tags. So outfitter tags are limited if there's an area that's considered to have some concern about harvest sustainability. We also do have some second resident tags available, and so those will either be increased or decreased depending on what the local or the regional wildlife specialists consider the harvest to be in terms of sustainability. We also do this thing because there's not many other options. Some of the operations people that work in this area will not allocate vacant outfitter areas. So we have these things called BMAs, bear management areas. Outfitter will have access to a BMA. They will be allowed to hunt only within the boundaries of that BMA. And so if an outfitter gives up the BMA or retires and there's concerns about sustainability of harvest in an area, oftentimes what we'll do is just not reallocate that BMA, and so reduce harvest pressure through sort of attrition in a sense. And in very rare cases, we also will reduce season lengths. And we have one example of this in the far southern part of the province in an isolated population on the Bruce Peninsula, where we've drastically reduced the harvest, the season, because of major concerns about the population's viability. And in that case, we actually got rid of the fall season completely and restricted the spring season down to just, I think, 1 week. And so we do have that option as well because of the lack of resident control. But, in theory, every single Ontarian, so several million people, could have bought a tag and gone and hunted in that 1 week in that area. So it's so still have a lot of lack of control in that regard. All right, so how do these sorts of harvest management decisions, how are they informed? And this is critical for sort of highlighting why we went about and did the work that I'll present in a couple slides. And there's two main ways. So first, top left figure here just shows harvest rate in a wildlife management unit over time. So using population information and growth rate information that I'll talk about in a second. We estimate harvest rates and can determine whether those harvest rates are sustainable based on past research. And then we also conduct these sustainability assessments on an annual basis. And so these are outlined on the bottom here and basically are very similar to what lots of jurisdictions do, which is use sort of thresholds of specific indicators of harvest that we hope will relate in some way to whether the harvest is sustainable or not. And so we use things like total harvest, so bears harvested per kilometer squared. And we have thresholds shown here in these different colors in the map. So, in the far northern reaches of the province, if 0.01 bears per kilometer squared, that would be the sort of limit that we put on harvest density. And then further in the south, that's 4 times the value down in these blue areas. We also set thresholds of percent female in the harvest at 40% and percent adult female in the harvest at 20%. So if those thresholds are exceeded in some way, then we, or if they're exceeded, then we suggest that there may be some issues around harvest sustainability. Okay, so what informs those assessments? So what data, what information goes into trying to actually inform whether those are reasonable or not? And much of this comes from 2 main sort of research efforts that took place over the last 40 or so years. One of these was 2 separate physical mark recapture efforts in the 80s and 90s. This work was conducted in both of our 2 main forest types, the mixed deciduous and boreal forest. And then from 2004 to 2011, we conducted a non-invasive genetic sampling and spatial capture recapture program to try to estimate density of bears across the province. This is used so that the capture recapture data is used, or sorry, the physical capture mark recapture data is used to inform growth rates by forest type. So that's then used to assess whether harvest rates are sustainable. And then the spatial capture recapture non-invasive work is used to estimate population abundance at the wildlife management unit scale to again help inform harvest rates. And then we also have additional monitoring programs that help to add context to all of this information. So we have a voluntary hunter tooth submission program where we ask hunters to submit a premolar or 2 premolars that can be used to age and then also identify adult females based on reproductive, whether they have reproduced based on cementum. And then we have wildlife food surveys that are conducted annually and conflict reporting. And again, these are kind of used just to mainly provide context to what's going on in other in the harvest. So, for example, bad food years, higher harvest. We understand that is a common pattern that we see across the province. When we have food failures, our harvest rates go way up. Okay, so that was sort of the high level view of Ontario's harvest management program as it existed in around 2017. So that program was put into place in 2009, or the ideas of that sort of that informed that program were put in place in 2009. And the harvest context was pretty stable in many ways at that time. So this figure here shows on the left the number of hunters in the province. The right was estimated harvest, residents in red, non-residents in blue, all hunters in black. And we've seen, lots of dynamics, of course, but relatively consistent harvest patterns up until that time. Starting in 2010, that changed significantly. And the main thing you can see there is that number of resident hunters has continued to increase really drastically, more than or coming close to doubling, certainly more than doubling since the early 2000s. And in 2016, 2015, we see for the first time that resident harvest was higher than non-resident harvest. And this coincided with the re-implementation of the spring black bear hunt across the entire province. And so our harvest patterns and who's harvesting bears and how they're harvesting bears is changing, or was changing really drastically in 2017 when this research I'll talk about was started. Those sustainability assessments based on those indicators of thresholds or threshold indicators also were suggesting the potential for significant overharvest across the province. And so I won't dig too much into this figure, but this shows all of our wildlife management units where there's bear harvest. And the darker colors, so black and red, indicate those areas where many years in a row, those indicators, the thresholds were being exceeded. So there was either higher than 20% female harvest or too high of a harvest density. And so we were seeing areas of the province where we had concerns based on those, or we were expected to have concerns based on those indicators. And then we had in many parts of the province cases like this here, where our apparent harvest rates were far exceeding what we consider to be sustainable. And so this shows, the figure shows over time our harvest rate, what is expected to be sustainable based on those physical capture recapture programs is shown in the dashed red line. Black line shows, based on harvest returns and our population survey data, what the actual harvest rate would be. And you can see this is 5 times, we were harvesting 5 times the number of bears that were expected to be in this area, which of course isn't possible. This is largely due to this being near a large park and probably receiving an influx of bears in the fall. But we had other parts of the province that showed similar patterns where our estimated harvest rates were far exceeding what we expected to be sustainable. So we had those things, and then we had a number of other challenges. So this is all in 2017. What the context was, we had a number of other challenges for sustainable management. So those vital rate studies, those physical capture recapture studies I had mentioned, were limited geographically and were quite old at this point, being done from the 80s and 90s. Our population estimates from our non-invasive work were becoming outdated. And at the time, we had a pilot spring bear hunt. So the expectation in 2017 is that there was going to be a decision in 2020 about whether to make that spring bear hunt permanent. So there's a lot of things going on at that time in 2017 that begged the question of what we needed to do, or whether we needed more updated information on bear population numbers to be able to better sustainably manage the population. So that brings me to what we actually did to address that issue. So our provincial scale population monitoring work, and I'll talk about that in the next bunch of slides. First, just to sort of the overarching objective, pretty simple in words, not necessarily in implementation, but estimate black bear population size in the province at multiple spatial scales. So both local scales as well as landscape and broader scales to help inform sustainable harvest management. And the main question underlying that was, comparing back to the previous non-invasive and spatial capture recapture work we had done, had there been change in abundance of black bears throughout the province? Some other research questions that we had for this was, obviously some obvious ones. I think, have we been over harvesting over the last decade? Are those sustainability indicators appropriate? Are they useful? Do they actually suggest changing numbers of bears, or declining bear numbers in those areas where those indicators thresholds are exceeded? And then another very big question that we had at the time was, can the bear population sustain continued growth in resident hunters. And so we'd seen, over 10 years, a doubling of the number of resident hunters. And at the time, there was a bit of a downturn, but we weren't certain whether that was going to maintain. There was a lot of indicators suggesting lots of interest for residents in hunting black bears. And so we were concerned about whether populations could sustain that. So to address that, we implemented this province-wide non-invasive genetic sampling program to estimate density of bears. So we established a network of these non-invasive hair sampling arrays. Each one of these black lines represents one of these arrays. We had 92 of them across the province. So each one of those little squiggly lines is a set of baited barbed wire corrals set along secondary roads and trails in the province. Each one of these little dots represents, these well-known things. I think a lot of folks know what these are. A corral with barbed wire around it, where you have some small amount of bait to attract the animal in the hopes that they leave a hair sample. And I'll talk a bit more specifics here in a second. So design specifics. So we had 92 of these arrays across the province. Every array had 40 detectors or 40 of these corrals at the array. So each of them consisted of 40 of these. These corrals were spaced around 1.5 kilometers apart, up to 6 kilometers apart, with the hope of increasing the number of recaptures at different traps for the same bear. They consisted of a single strand of barbed wire at 50 centimeters, and we baited, and these were strung on trees around a central tree that was baited with 3 cans of sardines suspended at about 2 meters above the ground. We sampled for 5 weeks, so 5 sampling occasions where we would go out, put sardines out, come back a week later, collect hair off of the barbed wire, and send those into our genetics lab. Our arrays were also spaced out to minimize the chance that we detect the same animal on multiple arrays, and we used just some past information we had on black bear home range during the spring in our different forest types to inform that spacing. And again, for folks who aren't all that or familiar with this sort of thing, the general idea goes like this. We set the bait out, bear's attracted in, comes into the corral, checks out the barbed wire, hopefully does this, where it walks over, leaves the hair sample, looks something like this. Usually not that much hair, but we'll go out every week, pull the hair off the barbed wire, put it in envelopes, and send it to the lab. Our lab that's based here at our offices, they then go through the sort of standard protocol the protocol that's now become pretty standard for doing genetic analysis of these hair samples. So they'll barcode every sample and then go through the whole PCR amplification and genotyping process. And so we used 16 microsatellite loci, including a sex marker, and obtained information on genetic identity of animals at each of these corrals across the province. And that can be used, or that is, data that can be used to fit spatial capture recapture models. So then this is where Eric's big part comes in. Obviously, Eric was involved with other parts as well, but he did all these analyses. We then estimated density at each one of these arrays of 40 traps using spatial capture recapture. And the specifics around how we did that. So we started off with a standard set of 15 candidate models, and we compared each of these models using the AICC. And we considered all interactive and additive effects on the 2 main parameters that are the parameters and covariates that I show here. And so for folks that aren't intimately familiar with spatial capture recapture, there's 2 main parameters. The first of these is G0. And this is basically the probability that if we were going to go and put one of these baited barbed wire corrals at an animal's center of activity during that time, so the time they spent the most time during our sampling period, what's the probability that it would go in there and leave a sample? And so we talk about this as G0, or the probability of detecting an animal at its activity center. And we looked at differences in sex, and we also allowed there to be a location-specific prior detection covariate, which essentially means that at trap A, if animal 1 came in and was detected, it could have either a higher or lower probability of being detected at that same trap in future sampling occasions. We also allowed those to interact, so to vary by sex. The second parameter in these spatial capture recapture models is the spatial decline in probability of detection, and basically gets, or sigma, basically gets at this idea that if we place these traps further from an animal's activity center, the probability of detecting them is lower. And so we can actually fit that declining detection function and identify the probability of detecting an animal at different distances from its estimated activity center. And we allowed that scale parameter to vary by sex, occasion, and we also fit a linear trend to that, so allowing it to change linearly across our 5 sampling occasions. Okay, so that was the sort of main sort of meat and potatoes version of sort of what we did. So we went out all of these traps, these 92 trap lines or arrays throughout the province, fit or collected data, fit models, and estimated density at each one of these places. So we got a density estimate at these local landscapes in across the entire province. For a number of reasons that I'll talk about, we wanted to obtain information at a broader spatial scale. And so I'm going to go through a number of slides about how we did this as well as why we did this first. But all of this is also spelled out really clearly in this article that Eric led that came out in 2022. And this is all about trying to estimate density at multiple spatial extents using this approach. And it used all the data that I talked about here. So there's a number of reasons why, particularly in Ontario, but I think elsewhere, we were interested in estimating density at a broader spatial scale than just these local landscapes that we were sampling using these arrays. And so I've got a couple slides that sort of spell out more explicitly why that is. First of these is shown here. So this figure shows GPS radio collar data from black bears that Marty Obard collared in the our in and around Algonquin Provincial Park. On the left, you see GPS collar data from the spring. This is when our barbed wire or our non-invasive sampling takes place, is during the springtime, so between May and late June. You can see these sort of stable, restricted area home ranges where bears are not traveling very far. On the right side shows fall. This is when the majority of our harvest happens, is in the fall. GPS locations from the fall. Bears moving really large distances, not uncommon. In other parts of the province, we've seen bears moving up to 300 kilometers between spring and fall. And more importantly, moving across multiple wildlife management units. So in the province, our scale of management is the wildlife management unit, but you can see some clear mismatches here, whereby when we do our sampling and can obtain our population estimates for a wildlife management unit, the bears that are then harvested in those units may or may not be bears that are part of that population in the spring. And so that presents lots of challenges for trying to understand sustainable harvest. You know, if we have a lot of bears that are coming in, we may be harvesting at a much higher or much lower rate for the local population than it may appear. We also see in our results of this work and in past work, major spatial variation in density. And so this figure shows the trap arrays in and around Algonquin Provincial Park, broken down by density class. And so, you know, this area in the north here, blue, there's over 30 bears per 100 square kilometers there, whereas we have less than 15 bears per 100 square kilometers in this southern one. And you can see just next door to each other, these two arrays have vastly different density of bears estimated to be there. This again presents pretty big challenges when looking at single trap lines per wildlife management unit, which is mostly what we had was only one trap line per unit. So for example, this northern unit here spans the entire that entire northern section above the park. And we placed one trap line there, but that may or may not be representative of the density of bears across the entire area. So that again gives us some concerns about using small samples of arrays to estimate density for use in harvest management. And what gives us, again, even more concern is the major spatial variation in uncertainty in those estimates. And so when we have these single arrays of traps, we often have very high uncertainty. And so these numbers, these values here with the arrows, show the coefficient of variation for the density estimate in each of these. And typically a rule of thumb that folks often use is a value of 0.2 or less for being able to robustly inform wildlife management or harvest management. And you can see 4 of the 6 of these are well above that value. And so we have major concerns for informing harvest management with such high uncertainty. Lastly, we also have some concerns and some issues with trying to compare back to previous work that was done. So one of the things we wanted to do, I mentioned we had done similar non-invasive sampling and spatial capture recapture work from 2004 to 2011. And we wanted to try to estimate trend or at least change in population density from that time to the current time. But our distribution of sampling changed for a number of reasons, but as shown here, so black dots are the location of our baited corrals in 2004 to 2011 for this area. and red is our current effort, which took place from 2017 to 2022. So again, with that large variation in density that we see in small, relatively small spatial areas, doing these comparisons one-to-one, so one array to one array in time gave us some heartburn and made us think that those may not be that valid. Also, that was borne out in some of our comparisons of just sort of where we detected bears at these trap lines. So this figure on the left, you can see trap locations from 2008, 2017 trap locations in X's, and this is just for a single trap line in northwestern Ontario. And on the right, you can see the black dots show where we caught bears. And so clearly we caught bears in the area where we had not previously sampled in 2008. So again, makes it very challenging for us to compare across time to look at changes in bear density on these specific arrays. All right, so how do we address that? And that's what the paper that Eric authored was all about, how we go about actually addressing that sort of issue. And the main way is to scale up from these array level density estimates to a broader spatial scale. And in our case, the scale is shown here. So these light gray lines show the boundaries of our wildlife management units. The thicker black lines show what we refer to as wildlife landscape zones or management zones. These are groups of wildlife management units that have similar ecological characteristics. And all of the arrays in each of these wildlife landscape zones, or zones I'll call them, were sampled in the same year. So we've sampled them all at the same time, 5 or 6 of these lines, of these arrays at once, and then use those to obtain an estimate at the broader spatial scale. So at the scale of that zone, a single density estimate. So the reason for this, in the past, what has often been done is that you can take all the arrays or all the traps, all the corrals within a single spatial extent, and you can just pool them, right? So you can put them all into the same model, estimate density using that one pool of a large number of corrals. The problem with that is that if you have variation in detection, so if there's differences in how animals interact with the traps or whatever it may be, if there's heterogeneity in detection across that area, that can lead to significant bias if you don't model it. And we know, that when we look, for example, in this area, there is significant differences in how bears behave and what are parameters for detection and spatial decline in detection, what those are estimated at in each trap line. So we do have significant spatial variation in detection. So what we did to sort of combat this was to take this idea that if we assume that across all of that zone, the entire spatial extent, that all of our activity centers come from a homogeneous Poisson distribution, meaning that there is constant density across that entire zone, but that there is variation, but it only is according to a Poisson distribution. We can then treat each of those arrays as this sort of independent replicate sample from a larger region. Sorry. That allows us to then fit array-specific models. So we do this in 2 stages. We fit one model to each array of 40 traps. That deals with that detection heterogeneity. We can go through our process of 15 candidate models, pick the one out that's the best model, has all of our detection parameters estimated at a local scale. And then we can just simply sum the means and variances to get an estimate at that broader spatial extent. Requires that assumption. If things vary differently than they would from a Poisson distribution, that assumption is violated and can lead to issues with our assessment, with our averaging. But as long as we can make that assumption, which I think is a fairly good one, and you can ask Eric about, I'll make that comment, and then you can ask Eric about why that is if you have those questions. But it does appear to be a fairly robust assumption at the scales we're dealing with. Then we can simply sum means and variances, and it gives us a situation like this. So again, that's that same map that we showed before, where you can see the significant variation in density as well as uncertainty in those density estimates. And then when we combine them, we get a pretty tight, pretty robust averaged estimate across all those areas, or across that entire area. Has a number of advantages. So the temporal comparisons are more valid, because of the spatial arrangement changing. So if we do have changing spatial distribution of our arrays, as long as we're sampling enough of them and considering them these independent replicate samples, we can still have valid temporal comparisons across that zone scale, not at the specific array scale, but we can compare between zones or within a zone over time. Also better able to detect change because of our reduced uncertainty, or at least we're better able to be confident that there is a change if we detect it. And then also working at that zone scale we feel it's much more biologically relevant because we're capturing at least most of the movements made by bears. Okay, so now I'm going to go into actually some of the results. I know that was a long time to get before I actually showed some results of some analyses that we did. So first, just showing those landscapes, so specific array level density estimates. These are again broken down by class of density on the left. So anything in red and orange is less than 10 or between 10 and 15 bears per 100 square kilometers estimated to be on the trap line. And then blue values blue lines are those where there's higher density. Scaling that up to that zone level, these numbers here show the number of bears estimated per 100 square kilometers within those zones. And again, these are averaged up from the array specific estimates. A couple of sort of highlights that we see here, nothing that surprising. Bear densities are consistently higher in more productive habitats. So our two main forest types are shown here with in between these black lines. You see the boreal forest, where we have an average of 16 bears per 100 square kilometers. And then these areas that are either at the boundary of forest types or squarely in the mixed deciduous forest, we have much higher densities, up to 49 bears per 100 square kilometers in our highest density estimate. And then across the boreal, consistent estimates of 10 to 20 bears per 100 square kilometers. Some crude comparisons here to our previous work, so 2004 to 11 compared to 2017 to 22. We see a moderate, slight to moderate decline in the average estimate of density in the boreal forest. We previously had around 18, and it was down to around 16. And then a moderate uptick in our mixed deciduous forest, going from around 24 bears per 100 square kilometers to around 28. And we do have two sort of relatively large parts of the province where, based on sort of the productivity of the habitat, the number of bears and the estimates of density are quite low. And those two areas are circled in blue here. So both of these areas are at the boundaries of these forest types. And we tend to see other places, over here we have 36 and 28 bears per 100 square kilometers at the boundary. These are quite low for being at the boundary of these two forest types, where there's quite a bit of fall forage, fall food in that mixed deciduous area. And particularly this estimate here of 9 bears per 100 square kilometers is really low, very low for that habitat type. And we also see this bear out when we conduct sort of crude comparisons over time. We haven't gotten things worked out with our older data to be able to do our direct sort of model-based comparisons of estimates of density across time. But if we look at just sort of simple numbers, all these areas shown in red have seen around a 30% decline in density from the 2004 to 2011 stretch to 2017 to 2022. Again, those are preliminary, but at that sort of magnitude of decline, it's likely that any sort of modeling vagaries that come about when we get our data in better shape from the older data are still likely going to show a major decline. It also bears out when we look at our harvest rates. And so these values here, I apologize, I wanted to change this slide a little bit, but I ran out of time before the talk today. But these show over different time periods what our estimated harvest rate has been for different administrative regions in the province. So we have 3 regions: southern, northeast, and northwest. And so you can see relatively high harvest for what we think the habitat can sustain. So in our southern region, we've seen around 9 to 12% harvest rate over the last decade, or over these time periods shown. Our northeast area, which is mostly boreal forest and has low productivity, has had around 11%, 10 to 11% harvest, which is quite high. And then the northwest, where we have probably some of our best bear numbers, we see relatively low harvest and particularly relatively low or very low since COVID, and that's mainly due to the lack of non-resident harvest. So most of our non-residents are American, and we're not able to travel to Canada during the early parts of the pandemic, and that had a major impact on our non-resident harvest. Okay, so I'm going to just wrap up this section, and I've still got 15 minutes. I want to leave some time for questions, so I'll just kind of quickly go through the last section after this. But just wanted to come back to some of those questions that we posed at the beginning of the talk. So has there been a change in abundance of black bears in the province? Yes, clearly in some areas we've seen some declines. We've seen some upticks in a few areas, but big parts of the province where we've seen some declines. Have we been over harvesting? Yes, likely in some of those areas, particularly where we're pushing into the 9, 10, 11% harvest in the boreal forest. We're almost certainly exceeding what's sustainable in those areas. Are those sustainability indicators that I showed earlier appropriate? Probably not. And I'll just show a couple things here. Again, this figure on the right, areas in black and red are those areas that had the biggest concerns based on those indicators of percent female harvest, percent adult female harvest. Those are, again, big areas of red and black would suggest low sustainability. Maybe, and then the one on the left shows the areas where we've had the biggest concerns in terms of potential declines. One of those is picked up. This one in the middle did have quite a few areas that showed up as red and black. This other area here, though, showed very low risk over in these units, but also that pretty significant likely decline. And then this area in the south where we see very high risk values according to those sustainability indicators. We see very robust, apparently very robust population numbers. So the indicators may work. I don't think anyone ever intended them to be used sort of in this way, where they're just a score that's thrown on a map and then we say they're sustainable or not. A lot of context is needed for using those sorts of indicators in trying to manage harvest. But just as a course view of their utility, they need some more work, and we're working on some new indicators from this work here. And then 10 bear populations sustain continued growth in hunters. And I would say, if we have been over harvesting, then we probably can't sustain continued growth in our resident hunter population, and probably need some sort of control on that in order to be able to manage what could be a major sort of strain on the population. All right, so just spend a couple minutes. I won't go through all of these things in this section, but I just wanted to touch briefly on how we're leveraging these data as well as some of our other monitoring data to try to answer additional questions beyond just simply, how many bears are there in each of these areas. Talked a bit about this already, but our primary monitoring programs that we have in the province, we have our population monitoring program, have human bear conflict monitoring, hunter surveys. So we send surveys out to hunters every year, and they're asked to mail them back. Recently, those have become mandatory, where you're actually not allowed to hunt in the next year if you don't complete them. So we're getting improved return rates there. And then we have the tooth submission program. And I'll talk about just probably two projects we've implemented using these data. The first of these is to use the monitoring data from the non-invasive work to try to estimate dispersal patterns. This is a master's student project, Evan Kopsala. He finished a couple of years back and published a paper with these work. But what he did essentially was to take the genotype data from each of these trap lines across the province and calculate this metric that's referred to as genetic flux. And the idea behind this is that it compares relatedness within an array, within one of those 40 baited corrals, to the relatedness of bears between that array and all the other arrays around it in the whole province. And it works off this idea that we assume that an area that has more closely related individuals is going to be a net exporter of animals compared to an area that has less closely related individuals. So if you have less closely related individuals, you're likely getting animals from multiple different areas coming into an area. Whereas if everyone's related, you're likely exporting animals. And so you use that to calculate this genetic flux value, which tells you essentially whether there's net immigration or emigration from an area. And then modeled the relative flux at each one of these arrays against covariates, specifically the density of bears on that array, habitat quality, which was just a very coarse metric of the forest type, and then harvest. This is the results of that. So this is a map for male bears based on those analyses. Blue would be net importing, so bears moving into an area in blue. Green would be bears moving out of an area. Each one of these dots is one of our arrays, and then the color is just sort of the creamed, smoothed, like interpolated values that across these different arrays. And so you can see big area in the middle of the province there that was a net importer of bears, parts of the province that are net exporters. Major finding from the sort of regression models he fit is that there's much higher flux into areas with lower density. So very strong relationship between density of bears and flux, whereby low density bears move in, high density bears move out. Matches well with what we think about dispersal theory, but interesting that we can show it with these data. And we also see net influx into the areas at the boundary of our forest regions. So those areas that are more productive right at the boundary of the two forest types, so the boreal and the mixed deciduous, have a net influx of bears as well. Very interesting also is that the area of greatest influx, so this really dark blue area in the just off of Lake Huron here, is also the area where we have the most concerns around some of the densities of bears. We have low numbers of bears. There's been high harvest in those areas. We've had the biggest change in the number of bears over time. So what we don't come out now and say it in the paper that Evan published, but likely what we're seeing is some source sink dynamics here, whereby those populations are heavily harvested, but also that harvest is even being supported by influx of bears from other areas. Okay, the last thing I'll quickly go through, just because it's actually really new data that we just got. I'm sort of excited. We're sort of excited about it, but it makes use of our bear tooth submission program to look at harvest and dispersal or movement of bears. So folks know who have worked with these sorts of data before. People submit premolar teeth. We can use that to get age of black bears or of any mammal species. They all put annual cementum layers on. We can count those to estimate age. We also can get reproduction from female bears because they'll put on thinner layers during years where they have cubs. But because these teeth often have tissue attached to them or just residual blood from being yanked out of the jaw, we can also get DNA from them. And with our large sort of non-invasive sampling network, we have several thousand black bear genotypes on here. We sought to combine these data types to assess whether we were picking up bears that were caught on our non-invasive arrays in our harvest samples. So we genotyped the teeth that we got back and matched them up to genotypes that we had from these arrays. And we just actually got these data yesterday, but over the last 5 years, we had 4,851 non-invasive sample profiles, and 311 of these showed up in our harvested bears across the province. And that's 6.5% of our sample bears that were harvested. And this is a significant underestimate because we only get maybe a fifth of the teeth that are actually submitted to us. And most of them are actually non-residents. We had several reductions in non-residents because of COVID. So this number is a major underestimate, but interesting that we are picking up a relatively good proportion of the bears that were sampled on our trap lines, on our arrays, in our harvest samples. We can actually have been looking into trying to fit models like duck band return models, sort of fits a similar type of approach as those types of models, where we actually may be able to estimate survival and harvest risk from this. And the other piece of information we can get from these data is movements. And so we looked at this, and 73 of these bears that were harvested and had genotypes from our non-invasive work. So 24% of these were actually harvested in different wildlife management units than those in which they were sampled. And so that's, again, another argument for that multi-scale or sort of broader spatial extent approach that Eric published, and for why we actually need to do that. We're getting a quarter of our bears harvested in a different unit than where they're sampled, so different populations of bears. And then we'll just wrap this up, skip over that last stuff. And so, what we see sort of in the future, next steps for all this work is that this sort of data that we have and the map that we have here, these estimates of density across this really large area, forms the basis of our future monitoring programs. And we've now developed it such that we're going to have sort of an annually rotating schedule where we go back to each of these landscapes and resample bears on these arrays. And so we have a rotating schedule or one of these zones in each of our regions. So 3 zones will be sampled every year, and we'll start to build up data on sort of trend over time with black bear numbers. And really the impetus for that is it seems with the data that we have, there may be some indicators we can use for harvest sustainability, but really density of bears, estimates of bear abundance is going to be our best metric for whether harvest is sustainable and whether bears can sustain the rates of harvest that we have now. So this will form the basis, along with our other monitoring programs going into the future, of how we manage bears in the province. And then happy to take questions. Maybe I'll just leave it on this because that's a pretty ugly slide. It's just blank white. But yeah, thanks very much. And happy to answer any questions. I see there's a couple in the chat, but yeah, happy to answer anything.
Yeah, and Joe, I'll do a lightning round with you real quick. I got 3 quick questions, and Sterling and Carl kind of were along the same lines. So the density estimates you're providing is everything except cubs, is that correct?
Yeah, 1 year, two, actually 4 yearlings as well, I believe, right, Eric? Eric's the one who actually calculated all those density estimates, and so I'll punt it to him a little bit. But yes, my understanding is it's 1 year and older, based on and our heights were based on sort of the some morphometric data we had on bears, the heights of the barbed wire. So yes, 2 years and older.
Okay.
The
And
published,
then,
well, I might, oh,
go ahead,
sorry.
Eric.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the published estimates are specific to bears aged greater than 1 year.
Okay.
And yeah, based on morphometric information that says most yearlings should go under that 50 centimeter wire without touching it. It's an assumption.
Right.
But before we calculate harvest rates or abundances, we use the reproductive and survival information from those long-term mark recapture studies in a population model with sustainable harvest at the sex ratio that we see to generate an expected age distribution for harvested populations in each of Boreal and Great Lakes St. Lawrence forests. We use that to add those cubs and yearlings back in to our population estimates before we then calculate our harvest rate.
Okay. Okay, thank you. I'm wondering if you why you chose to use the reward bait rather than the lure that most of the other projects use. Did you see any bias towards male visitation because of that?
Yeah, I'll kick it to Eric again because he was around when that was this decision was made. I was not, but I'm guessing Eric, it was largely because of just what had been done in the past, right?
Yeah, legacy effects on the bait for sure. We used to have the scent station index lines, which some people may be familiar with. You don't set the barbed wire, you just hang the sardines, and you get a bear did or did not visit 30 of 50 stations sort of thing. So that was sardines when we first started the barbed wire hair trap work. In 2004, there was a desire to sort of validate the scent stations against the estimates of absolute abundance. So yeah, we've stuck with sardines throughout. We do see trap responses, and we often see that sex times trap response interaction. But the females have higher capture probabilities and a stronger behavioral response when there's a difference.
Okay.
I hope
And
that
then
answers the
last question, did you guys use technicians as far as application on the ground, or did you use the staff throughout those WMAs?
Yes,
And
the latter. Yeah.
you did. Okay. So how many arrays did each staff member have? And was it sustainable in their workload?
It was a challenge for sure. So
Okay.
so it depended on the office, and it depended on the office. There was a few that had 3 arrays in a single year that they helped with, and that was their entire workload over that 5-week period. There were some that had 1. Going forward with our regular monitoring, we're trying to limit that to max of 2 arrays per sort of office that deals with that. But yeah, no, we relied on regular staff in our regional, our district offices that are distributed across the entire province. It would have, frankly, impossible without that. Each of these lines needed to be sampled by, 4 to 5 people in many cases, just because sometimes they're by ATV. And so some were in pretty challenging areas to access. And so, and in some years we sampled up to 30 of these arrays at once. And so the number, the 150 people, it would be pretty challenging with technicians. And so it was all regular duties of our ministry staff. And we had pushback for sure from some of their supervisors and managers about the workload. But it was a high priority. A lot of this, actually, the impetus for this work came from those district offices because of concerns about harvest sustainability. And so they were bought in pretty heavily on it. And so it worked out well.
Okay. Yeah, no, this is great. This is super useful. Can you unshare that real quick, and I'll go to the hands here. John, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, interesting talk. Yeah, I just have a couple questions. The first one was, when you select your arrays relative to the larger survey areas, is there any concern that whether they were a representative sample of the densities in those larger areas? I'm just curious what criteria you use for that. Yeah,
so we definitely had that concern. We did an assessment of it when we were laying them out. So a lot of what we did was to rely on the older array distribution. We made those longer. We put in more traps, trying to branch them more to get sort of less linear arrays. But we did have that concern. We did an assessment just based on habitat type, so land cover type, whether they were representative of the broader region. So largely they did match up. They were representative of the larger region in terms of land cover type. But it's hard to know whether they were representative in terms of density. I think for the most part, there wasn't anything about those there. I'm sure there's nuances array to array where one may have just happened to have an outfitter that harvests a lot of bears on that array or not. And so I'm sure there is some nuances there throughout these data. But there wasn't anything that we could assess, with satellite imagery or even really on the ground that would indicate that they were different than the rest of the landscape. Ontario is very roaded, has a lot of access, a lot of timber harvest, and so they're as representative as we feel we can get, I guess, would be the thing. And without knowing, a priori what the density is, I think we did most of what we could do to try to ensure that we were at least sampling the right habitat types according to their proportion throughout the broader landscape.
Okay, no, that's interesting. And it seems like your density service modeling can give you some inference there too. And just one other question was with a linear transect, one concern with those sometimes is that if you have non-circular home ranges, that can create issues with sigma or density. Have you looked into that at all, or do you think that that's an issue at all?
Yeah, so I'll let Eric answer the second part of it, but yeah, we try to make them branched as much as possible to get away from that linear. So they're on roads, but they're not linear per se. But yeah, Eric, you can go ahead because I know you've looked into some of that stuff.
Yeah, and that is a difficult one. So my understanding was if home ranges are not circular and oriented in a consistent direction with respect to the arrays, and then our arrays are on roads, right? So are home ranges aligned in the same direction as the roads, or are they aligned perpendicular to roads? So they're fairly long. They're 60 kilometers. They're about 60 kilometers long. And then we do try and branch them and curve them. They go over hills and past lakes and wetlands. I can't think of any reason for the home ranges to be aligned with the arrays except the roads. But when we compare our distances moved between traps to home range estimates from GPS collars and radio collars from older work, it's not apparent that the bears are traveling further along the roads between traps than they would during their normal expected home range behavior at that time of year. So we think that a female home range during the breeding season is often, might have a diameter of about 5 kilometers. That's going to be a little larger in the north and maybe a little smaller in the south. But we very rarely see female bears caught at traps more than 6 kilometers apart. And the vast majority are caught at traps 1.5, 3 kilometers apart. So yeah, that distribution of capture distances doesn't suggest that the roads are stretching the home ranges out. And I can't think of much else that would have them all oriented in the same direction with respect to the array.
And we did assess that a bit, Eric. Like we, Robbie did that analysis and that published that paper looking at, we tried, there's these SCCR models that you can use that look at sort of connectivity and landscape resistance, and you can model movement of bears according to habitat covariates. And so we did fit those. We didn't, there was variability. There was somewhere those worked, somewhere bears did move according to certain landscape covariates. But there was nothing consistent like that, like Eric said, that would suggest some sort of, systematic bias across that entire area.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you. Good talk, you guys.
Yeah. And Dana, you said your question was right in the lines of that last one. So
it did, but then it re-arose. So
well, let's finish it. We got time for one more.
That'd be great. So yeah, a really great talk. That was really interesting, and just I'm really kind of impressed with the kind of work you guys are getting to do. So in regards to the linear transects beyond behavior, I mean, like I've worked with simulations and with an empirical small mammal trapping data set where we had 100 trap grids with 10 by 10, and then we subsample like say a 3 by 10 grid out of it. And you can really bias your sigma estimates with those linear transects, which then end up biasing your, even without a difference of behavior, even when it's circular home ranges. So I just like, yeah, I was really curious to that. It does sound like, I mean, like, and I don't know if fitting the ecological distance model or some sort of resistance model will take into like that kind of bias. I was just curious about that. We ended up resolving it on another study I was on by adding parallel transects. And it really did seem to make a difference. But yeah, that was just my question, is just like, how do you, I saw that you have some that aren't as linear as others. And then, so. But.
Yeah, no, and I don't, yeah, well, go ahead, Eric. I see you got, yeah, I always like to be able to kick these to you.
I don't have a great answer for that. I thought in theory, if the home ranges are circular, that linear array or an SECR transect, which people do area searches along transects as well, to collect SECR data.
Yeah.
So it is a concern. There is an issue with underestimation of variance. I'd love to see the work. Of course, if you subset and it changes your sample size, then you can have erratic estimates, but I assume you're probably controlling for that. So no, Joe, I don't, I thought I should speak up, but I don't have a great answer. There was the work by Ivan et al. With snowshoe hares. There's been work by Murray Efford and others. None of it has convinced me that our point estimates should be severely biased, but we absolutely need to continue to look into it. The linearity and the roads, we absolutely need to continue to look into.
Yeah,
And one of the things is an advantage to of that approach from where we scale up is that we also, I don't know that we would expect a directional bias either. So I'm certain across our 92 landscapes that we've got ones that have a biased estimate. But that's again an advantage of scaling up, and also going back to these areas time and again is that if we have bias high, bias low, hopefully those cancel out when we average and do this at this broader scale. We have talked about, like particularly we have a couple of these lines that we run year after year. We have talked about trying to put a bunch of traps way off roads and make it more grid-like. And the problem is then you are sampling a different population. We have big changes in variation or changes in density that happen at full spatial distances, and so it's it's a bit of a hard one to get your head around how to directly address, because you do end up sampling somewhat different populations. Once you span that line out, you have more data, lots of things start going on. So yeah.
Are you collaring the bears for the traditional market capture study, or do you have like telemetry data you could try to integrate in to see if it really changes your sigma estimate? Because that'd be one way to check it.
Not at the same time. We don't have any active sort of collaring stuff. The last stuff that was done in that Algonquin Provincial Park by Marty in the mid 2010s. And so, although Eric, I don't know, did you guys have any spatial capture, like non-invasive sampling going on at the same time as that? Like, was that I can't remember if you guys had one going on then or not.
There would have been a few collared bears detected on trap lines in Algonquin. Yeah. I think there should have been. We tried, and we even tried to push one of those trap lines quite far from the road, where it started, sort of where the road ended, and we walked in for a ways and then set some traps. But I don't think we were able to get a grid or 40 traps. So no, I don't think we have. I say we have very little, if any, synchronous data, and then it would be a small sample of bears.
I think even the application Richard Chandler did with it, I think it's 2013. I can't remember if it's Royal or Chandler 2013, but it's when all the slug of those papers came out. I think they were only using 3 bears for that initial one. So I think it might be, I mean, to me, that would just be a way to validate it, right? Like to say like, okay, we're not worried about it, like.
No, it's a good point. Yeah, for sure.
Dave, bring us home real quick.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a super general question for you, Joe. And I was in your job before, and I think I know the general answer to it, but I'd like to hear it from you. So this is all like really expensive, really manpower consuming, very technical. I mean, everything, and it's all to try to get a harvest that is close to the maximum sustainable yield. Another approach would be you institute a quota system and cut the harvest in half everywhere, and you know that that's a safe harvest. And why can't you just do that?
We turn the recording off? No. So social determinants of policy. I think is the easy answer there. I think, you know, I don't think that would be palatable for our decision makers to do something like that. I think going from a quota-free system to a hard quota on everything, I think would be challenging. You know, there was a social science survey done recently in Ontario and estimated, you know, $50 million. Bear hunting brings in $50 million to the economy. This is, you know, on the order of a couple $100,000 per year to run. Not this work. This was more, but you know, going forward, you know, less than $200,000 per year. So the decision makers seem to be comfortable with that return on investment for monitoring versus just cutting tags. You know, I think there is some movement towards a resident allocation system because regardless of the monitoring, I think you know, we can monitor, but if we don't have a way to limit, that doesn't do much for us. And so I think there will be some push towards that. And so, you know, then we need to make that decision based on something. So yeah, I would say it's the political, social side of the equation is what keeps us from doing what you suggested, Dave.
And also a concern that you would end up with too many bears eventually. Is that true?
That too. I mean, Ontario's an interesting place in that we have a very big province, most of which is inhabited by not that many people, and then we have a lot of people in the Greater Toronto area that I don't know that would be like for sure. I think there's that concern in northern cities and towns about too many bears. I don't know that that's a concern in the vast majority of the voting public. So I think it's actually the opposite, and I think that, you know, that's what led to the cancellation of the spring hunt was concerns over animal welfare and orphaned cubs. You know, that's what essentially led to that. And my predecessor got in a lot of trouble for saying there was absolutely no science basis for that decision. So I think I think that part of Ontario, you know, that piece of it with a huge urban center that doesn't have any interaction with bears being all of the province, I think it influences those things a lot.
I'm going to go ahead and end it. Folks want to stick around afterwards, but I do want to formally say thank you to Joe, also to Eric. Super talk, really interesting to a lot of folks and very useful for agencies. So appreciate the work and giving this talk, and we'll see you all at the next NABIT webinar.
Yeah,
thank you.
I'll hang around as well for sure. Happy to talk more.
Okay, thanks everyone.